The sold sign stayed in front of my house for less than 48 hours. I should have felt relief. After all, that sale would pay off every debt I had. But when I handed the keys to the new owner, I had the feeling I was leaving behind far more than a house. I was saying goodbye to the life I had built over nearly 4 decades. A week later, I boarded a plane to the Philippines, believing I was running away from my problems. It wasn't until much later that I realized what I actually needed was not to escape, but to begin again. Before we continue, make sure you're already subscribed to this channel, and please write in the comments which country or city you're watching this from. I always read them. My name is Margaret Wilson. I'm 73 years old, and for 38 years I was a nurse at St. Joseph's Hospital in Phoenix, Arizona. If you had told me, back when I was still a younger woman full of certainty about how my life would unfold, that I would spend my 70s alone in a foreign country, learning to bargain for mangoes in a language I didn't speak, I would have laughed you out of the room. But life doesn't ask permission before it changes everything. I met my husband, Frank, in the hallway of that same hospital many years ago now, back when I was a young nurse fresh out of school, still terrified of making a mistake that could cost someone their life. He was a maintenance electrician, older than me by a few years, with a kind of steady confidence that made the whole hospital feel a little less overwhelming whenever he was around. He fixed a flickering light in the ICU one night while I was charting, and he made a joke so bad I actually laughed out loud for the first time in a 16-hour shift. We were married less than a year later. We built a life the way most people of our generation did, slowly, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet Phoenix neighborhood early in our marriage. It had a lemon tree in the backyard that Frank planted the same week we moved in, half joking that he wanted something that would outlive the mortgage. It did. That tree is probably still standing, though it isn't mine anymore. We had one son, Michael. Frank worked at the hospital for over 3 decades before retiring. I stayed even longer, well past the age most of my colleagues had already left. Nursing wasn't just a job to me. It was the frame around which I built my identity. I liked being needed. I liked walking into a room where someone was frightened and leaving it with them a little less frightened than before. There is something about that work that gets into your bones, that shapes the way you see the entire world, as a series of people who need help and a series of small chances to give it to them. Frank and I always imagined our retirement would look a certain way. Not extravagant. We were never people who dreamed of yachts or exotic vacations. We imagined slow mornings with coffee on the back patio, watching the lemon tree grow taller. We imagined trips to see Michael and, eventually, grandchildren. We imagined growing old together in the house we'd spent our whole lives paying for, watching the neighborhood change slowly around us while we stayed exactly where we were, rooted like that tree. We got some of that, not all of it. Frank was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer during a season that already felt like the whole world was falling apart, when everything outside our front door seemed uncertain and frightening in ways none of us had experienced before. I won't dwell too long on those months, because if you've lost someone the way I lost him, you already know what that kind of grief feels like, and if you haven't, I hope you never have to learn firsthand. I will say this: nursing prepares you to care for the dying in a hospital room, surrounded by equipment and colleagues who know exactly what to do. Nothing prepares you to watch your husband of more than 4 decades disappear in your own bedroom, holding his hand, unable to do a single thing to stop it. All those years of training, all that competence I'd built up over a lifetime of caring for strangers, and in the end I could do nothing more for the person I loved most than simply sit beside him and hold his hand while he slipped away. Frank died, and I was left alone for the first time since I was a young woman just starting out in my career. I remember the strange quiet of the house in the days that followed, how loud silence can be when you're used to sharing your life with another voice, another set of footsteps moving through the rooms. I would wake up in the middle of the night and reach across the bed out of habit, forgetting for one disorienting moment that there was no longer anyone there to reach for. People imagine financial ruin as something dramatic, a single catastrophic event, a stock market crash, a bankruptcy filing with lawyers and courtrooms. My experience wasn't like that at all. It was slow. It was almost polite, in the way it crept in, so gradual that I barely noticed it happening until it had already happened. After Frank died, I discovered that our finances were more fragile than I had understood. Frank had always handled our investments and our retirement accounts. An old-fashioned arrangement, maybe, but one that worked for us for over 4 decades. What I learned in the months after his death was that his pension had been structured in a way that significantly reduced my survivor benefits. Our savings, which I had always assumed were substantial, had been quietly drained over the previous years by his medical treatments insurance didn't fully cover, experimental options we pursued out of desperation, specialists in other states we flew to see because we were willing to try absolutely anything that might buy us more time together. I didn't know the full extent of it until I sat down with our finances for the first time, months after the funeral, a stack of statements spread across our kitchen table like some terrible puzzle I was too grief-stricken to solve. I remember staring at those numbers for hours, unable to make sense of columns and figures that should have been simple arithmetic, but instead felt like a foreign language I'd never learned to read. The math, when I finally forced myself to do it, was brutal. My Social Security and what remained of Frank's pension covered perhaps 60% of my monthly expenses. The house, which we had refinanced more than once over the years, once to help Michael through a rough patch in his younger years, once to cover a portion of Frank's treatment, still carried a mortgage. Property taxes in Phoenix had climbed steadily over time. My health insurance premiums, even with Medicare, ate into what little cushion I had left. I did what I think most people in my generation do. I told no one, not my son, not my closest friends from the hospital, not even my sister in Ohio. There is a particular kind of shame that comes with financial trouble later in life, a feeling that you should have figured this out by now, that you are somehow failing at a subject you should have mastered decades ago. I had spent my whole career taking care of other people. Admitting I couldn't take care of myself felt like admitting I had failed at the one thing I was supposed to be good at. For nearly 2 years, I did what so many people do. I used credit cards to cover gaps I couldn't otherwise fill. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd catch up next month, then the month after that, always pushing the reckoning a little further down the road. I stopped going to the dentist for anything but emergencies. I canceled subscriptions I'd had for years. The newspaper, a streaming service Frank and I used to watch together. Small things that felt enormous in their absence. Each cancellation another small grief, layered on top of the larger one I hadn't finished processing. I kept the thermostat set high through the brutal Phoenix summers, telling myself I'd always run a little cold anyway, when really I was simply trying to shave a few dollars off every electric bill. By the time I finally admitted the truth to myself, I owed a staggering amount across 3 credit cards and a home equity loan I'd taken out, convinced it would solve the problem rather than deepen it. My monthly minimum payments alone exceeded what I had left over after covering my mortgage and utilities. I was in my early 70s, doing the kind of arithmetic that kept me awake in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling of a bedroom that suddenly felt far too large for one person. My son Michael lives in Denver with his wife and 2 children. We talk on the phone regularly, and he visits when he can, though when he can has become less frequent as his own life has grown busier. A mortgage of his own, 2 kids in school, a demanding job in logistics that keeps him traveling more than either of us would like. I finally told Michael the truth on an ordinary Sunday phone call. I remember exactly where I was standing, in the kitchen, looking out at that lemon tree, now taller than the fence line, heavy with fruit neither Frank nor I would ever pick together again. Michael was quiet for a long moment after I finished explaining. Then he said the thing I had been dreading, and also somehow desperately needing to hear. "Mom, you have to sell the house." I argued with him, of course. That house held 4 decades of my life inside its walls. It held Frank's handwriting on the inside of a closet door, marking Michael's height every year until he was nearly grown. It held the kitchen where I'd learned to cook, badly at first, and then well enough that Frank stopped teasing me about it. It held grief and love in equal measure, layered so thickly into the walls that I couldn't imagine anyone else living inside them. Couldn't imagine strangers walking through rooms that held so much of what my life had actually been. But Michael was right, and some part of me had known it for months, maybe longer, even if I hadn't let myself say it out loud. The math simply didn't work. My debt was growing faster than I could pay it down. My income wasn't going to change, and the house, despite everything it meant to me, represented the only real asset I had left. My equity in it, after decades of payments, was substantial. Phoenix real estate had appreciated significantly since we first bought the place. I put the house on the market not long after that conversation. I remember standing in the front yard the morning the "For Sale" sign went up, feeling like I was watching a stranger install a marker on my own grave. It sold quickly. The market in Phoenix was hot, and the buyer, a young couple expecting their first child, made a full-price offer almost immediately. There was something almost cruel about how easily it happened, how quickly a life could be converted into a number, wired into a bank account, and then simply gone. 40 years of marriage, of raising a child, of building something with another person, reduced in the end to a wire transfer and a set of keys handed across a kitchen counter to strangers. After paying off the mortgage, the home equity loan, and every credit card balance in full, I was left with a sum that should have felt like a fortune. Instead, sitting in my empty living room the night before closing, surrounded by boxes, I did the math on what that money would actually buy me in America, and the fortune began to look considerably smaller. Invested conservatively, that money might generate only a small amount of additional income each year. It would cover a modest apartment for a couple of years if I spent it directly on rent, less if I needed to eat and see a doctor and buy gas for my car in the meantime. I was in my 70s. That sum of money felt less like a fresh start and more like a countdown clock, ticking down toward some unknown point where the money would simply run out and I would have nothing left to fall back on. I remember sitting on the floor of my empty living room. I'd sold most of the furniture along with the house, and crying in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry since the week Frank died. Not because I'd lost the house, because I suddenly understood with total clarity that I had no idea what my life was supposed to look like next. I had spent so many years being someone's wife, someone's nurse, someone's mother, and now, sitting alone on an empty floor, I realized I didn't actually know who I was underneath all of those roles, or what I wanted for whatever years I had left. The idea came from an unlikely source, a former colleague from St. Joseph's named Delia Santos, a nurse I'd worked alongside for many years before she retired and moved back to her home country, the Philippines. We'd stayed in touch sporadically over the years, mostly online, the occasional message exchanged around birthdays or holidays. When I posted, in a rare moment of vulnerability, a vague comment about big changes ahead, Delia messaged me directly, and within a day we were on the phone together for the first time in years. We talked for nearly 2 hours that first call. She told me about her life in a small city outside Cebu, how her monthly expenses, including rent for a comfortable 2-bedroom condo, food, utilities, And even a part-time helper who cleaned and cooked twice a week came to a fraction of what I was spending just to survive in Phoenix. She told me about the healthcare system, which, while different from what I was used to, was accessible and, for many procedures, dramatically less expensive than in the United States. She told me about the community of expatriates and retirees, many of them Americans in exactly my position, who had made similar decisions for similar reasons and who had found, on the other side of that decision, a quality of life they hadn't imagined possible on their limited retirement incomes. I'll be honest, my first reaction was to dismiss the idea entirely. It felt reckless, even a little absurd. I was an elderly widow who had never lived outside Arizona for more than a few weeks at a time in my entire life. The idea of moving to a country on the other side of the world, where I knew no one but a single old colleague, felt less like a plan and more like a fantasy I was indulging because reality had become too painful to face directly. But over the following weeks, as I sat in the extended stay hotel Michael had helped me book, a temporary solution while I figured out my next step, the numbers kept pulling me back to the idea. I ran the math obsessively, the way I imagine some people compulsively check a wound to see if it's healing. Staying in Phoenix meant stretching my limited savings across an unknown number of years in one of the more expensive housing markets in the country, likely needing to return to some form of work despite my age and the physical toll decades of nursing had already taken on my body. Moving to the Philippines, according to Delia, and the research I did late into countless nights, could mean that same money, combined with my Social Security income, might actually let me live comfortably, not just survive, but live, for the remainder of whatever years I had left. I called Michael. I expected him to talk me out of it. Instead, after a long silence, he said something that surprised me. "Mom, I've watched you sacrifice everything for other people your whole life. Dad, me, your patience. Maybe it's time you did something just for you, even if it scares you." I cried again that night, but this time it felt different. Less like grief, more like something loosening in my chest that had been clenched tight for years, some knot I hadn't even fully realized I was carrying until I felt it begin, ever so slightly, to release. The months between deciding to move and actually boarding the plane were, in some ways, harder than the decision itself. There is a particular grief that comes with disposing of a life's accumulated belongings. Not the big things, like the house, which had already been sold, but the small things. Frank's tools, still organized in the garage exactly the way he'd left them, each one in its proper place, as though he might walk back in at any moment and pick up exactly where he left off. Photo albums going back to our wedding day, furniture we'd chosen together when we were young, when we thought we understood what our lives would look like forever, when the future still felt like something solid and predictable rather than the uncertain thing it actually turned out to be. I kept far less than I gave away. Michael took some of his father's tools and a handful of family photographs. I donated most of the furniture to a local charity that helps domestic violence survivors furnish new apartments, something that felt right, somehow, giving pieces of my old life to women who were building new ones of their own, just as I was about to do myself, in my own way, at the far other end of life from where those women stood. I sold my car. I sold jewelry I hadn't worn in years, pieces that had sat in a drawer collecting dust for so long I'd almost forgotten I owned them. I kept 2 suitcases worth of belongings, clothing suited to a tropical climate I'd never experienced, a handful of photographs, my nursing license and medical records, and a small wooden box containing Frank's wedding ring, which I couldn't bring myself to sell or leave behind, no matter how much I was trying to simplify everything else about my life. Delia helped me navigate the practical realities from a distance. The retiree visa program that many older Americans use to establish long-term residency in the Philippines. The health insurance options available to expatriates. the neighborhoods near her that might suit someone arriving for the very first time. I spent countless hours researching, watching videos made by other American retirees who'd made similar moves, trying to absorb as much as I could before landing somewhere I'd never been, older than most people who make this kind of leap entirely alone. I told very few people what I was doing. My sister in Ohio was supportive, but clearly worried, asking me more than once if I'd really thought this through. A question I understood came from love, but that still landed like a small wound each time she asked it. A few friends from my nursing days reacted with open skepticism. One told me, not unkindly, that it sounded like something you do when you're running from something, not towards something. I didn't have a good answer for her at the time. I'm not sure I fully do now, even looking back on everything that's happened since. Maybe both things were true at once. Maybe most big decisions in life are made up of both fear and hope in roughly equal measure, tangled together so tightly you can't fully separate one from the other. The night before my flight, I sat alone in the extended stay hotel room, my 2 suitcases packed by the door, and I allowed myself, for the first time in months, to simply feel afraid. Not the productive fear that pushes you toward planning and preparation, but the raw, unfiltered fear of a woman who was about to get on a plane toward a life she could not fully picture. At an age when most people are settling more deeply into what they already know, rather than starting over entirely. I thought about Frank that night more than I had in a very long time. I wondered what he would think of all this. The house gone, the decision made, his wife of so many years about to fly across the world alone. I decided, sometime in the small hours of the morning, that he would have understood. Frank was never a man who feared change. He was the one who planted a lemon tree the week we moved into a house neither of us was certain we could afford, betting on a future he trusted we'd build together, one small act of faith at a time. I boarded my flight to Cebu carrying 2 suitcases and a fear so large it felt like a third piece of luggage I couldn't check. Nothing prepares you for the disorientation of arriving somewhere completely foreign later in life. The flight itself was long, with layovers that stretched the journey out for the better part of a full day, and by the time I landed in Cebu, I was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, a kind of bone-deep disorientation that made the entire experience feel slightly unreal, like I was watching my own life happen from a small distance, unable to fully step inside of it yet. Delia met me at the airport. Seeing her familiar face in the middle of an unfamiliar country did something to loosen the knot that had been sitting in my chest for weeks. She'd arranged for me to stay in a small furnished apartment in her building for the first stretch of time, giving me a chance to get oriented before committing to a longer-term lease of my own. The heat hit me first, a thick, humid warmth completely unlike the dry desert heat of Phoenix, the kind that settles into your clothes within minutes of stepping outside. Then the sounds, motorbikes, street vendors calling out, music spilling from open-air restaurants, a rhythm of daily life entirely different from the quiet suburban streets I'd spent decades walking. The first weeks were, if I'm being completely honest, some of the hardest of my life, harder, in some ways, than the months immediately after Frank died, because that grief at least had a familiar shape to it. This was something new, the disorientation of not understanding how to navigate the simplest daily tasks. I didn't know how to hail the right kind of transportation. I struggled with basic phrases in Cebuano, the local language, feeling foolish attempting words that came out clumsy and wrong. I got lost more than once trying to find the local market, ending up in tears on a street corner, an elderly American woman clearly out of her depth, until kind strangers, and there were, remarkably, always kind strangers nearby, helped me find my way back. I called Michael more in those first weeks than I had in the previous couple of years combined. I didn't tell him how frightened I was, not fully. I didn't want to hand him more worry than he already carried on my behalf. But he could hear it anyway. The way children, even adult children, can often hear the things their parents don't say out loud. "Do you want to come home, Mom?" he asked me during one particularly difficult call after I'd spent an entire afternoon crying in my small apartment, overwhelmed by everything at once: the heat, the unfamiliarity, the grief for a life I'd left behind, the fear that I'd made an irreversible mistake at an age when mistakes felt harder to undo than they once had. I told him I didn't know. And I meant it. What changed, I think, wasn't any single dramatic moment. It was a slow accumulation of small ones, the way most real change actually happens, regardless of how satisfying a single turning point story might be to tell afterward. It was learning gradually which street vendor sold the best mangoes, and having him start setting aside the ripest ones for me once he recognized my face and began to greet me each morning like an old friend rather than a stranger. It was Delia introducing me to a small group of other retirees, some American, some Australian, one delightful couple from Canada, who met regularly at a restaurant near the water to share a meal and swap stories about their lives before and after this decision we'd all made in different ways and for different reasons, each of us carrying our own version of the fear and hope that had brought us here. It was the morning, some weeks in, when I woke up and realized I'd slept through the entire night without waking in the small hours to do anxious math in my head, the first truly unbroken night's sleep I'd had in a very long time. It was finding a small church a short walk from my apartment, not the same denomination I'd grown up with, but close enough, and discovering that the simple ritual of weekly services gave a shape to my week that I hadn't realized I was missing, a small anchor point around which the rest of my days could organize themselves. It was eventually the day I signed a lease on a small but genuinely lovely one-bedroom condo overlooking a garden courtyard, furnished simply but comfortably, costing me less per month than I used to pay for auto insurance alone back in Phoenix. Combined with my Social Security income and careful management of what remained from the house sale, I discovered, with a kind of disbelief that took a long while to fully settle into, that I was no longer doing anxious math in the middle of the night. I was, for the first time in years, not just surviving, but living with something resembling ease, something I hadn't dared to expect I would ever feel again. I found, too, that the skills I'd built over nearly 4 decades of nursing hadn't simply evaporated because I'd crossed an ocean. Within my small community of expatriates, word spread that I'd been a nurse, and I found myself, almost accidentally, becoming a kind of informal resource, someone people called when they weren't sure whether a symptom warranted a doctor's visit, someone who could translate medical terminology for people navigating an unfamiliar healthcare system, someone whose decades of experience still mattered, still had value, even here, even now, even at an age when so many people assume a person's usefulness has already come to an end. Eventually, that informal role became something more structured. I began volunteering several mornings a week at a small community health clinic that served both local residents and the growing expatriate population, offering basic health screenings and education. It wasn't a paycheck, I didn't need it to be. What it gave me instead was something I hadn't realized how badly I'd missed since retiring: the feeling of being useful, of walking into a room where someone needed help and leaving that room having provided it. Exactly the same feeling that had carried me through nearly 4 decades of nursing back home. I want to be honest because I think the honest version of this story matters more than a tidy one. It wasn't all ease and discovery. I still had hard days. Days when the loneliness of being so far from Michael and my grandchildren felt unbearable. Days when grief for Frank resurfaced unexpectedly, triggered by something as small as a song playing in a restaurant, or the particular slant of afternoon light falling across a wall in a way that reminded me of our old kitchen. I still occasionally felt like an outsider, a guest in someone else's country, uncertain whether I truly belonged, wondering some nights whether I had made the right choice or simply traded one set of difficulties for another, unfamiliar set. But underneath those harder days, something had genuinely shifted. I no longer woke up with dread pooling in my stomach before I even opened my eyes. I no longer felt like my life was a problem I was failing to solve. I felt, for the first time since Frank's diagnosis, something that resembled peace, a settled quiet in my chest that I hadn't known in years and had almost forgotten was even possible to feel. I've been living in the Philippines for a while now, long enough that it has genuinely started to feel like home rather than an extended visit. Michael and his family have since come to visit, their first trip to see me in this new life, and the first time I'd hugged my grandchildren in far too long. Watching my grandson's face light up at his first taste of fresh mango, picked that same morning from a tree near my apartment, is a memory I suspect I'll carry for whatever years I have left, tucked right alongside the memories of Frank and the lemon tree and everything that came before. People sometimes ask me, when they learn my story, whether I regret selling the house. It's a fair question, and for a long time I wasn't sure how to answer it honestly. The house held decades of memories that I can never fully recover. Frank's handwriting on that closet door, the lemon tree he planted, a version of my life that no longer exists and never will again. But I've come to understand something I couldn't have understood while I was still living inside that grief. The house was never actually the thing I was mourning. What I was mourning was a version of my future I had imagined with Frank. The two of us growing old together on that back patio, watching the lemon tree grow. That future had already ended the moment he died. Selling the house didn't take that future away from me. It had already been gone for years, and I simply hadn't let myself admit it. Selling the house simply forced me, finally, to stop trying to live inside a future that no longer existed and to start building a new one instead, brick by brick, in a place I never expected to call home. I think about the woman I was standing in that empty living room the night before closing, crying on the floor, terrified that the money from the sale represented a countdown clock rather than a fresh start. I wish I could tell her what I know now, that the number in her bank account was never really the thing that mattered most. What mattered was her willingness, later in life than most people would dare, to admit that the life she'd built, however beautiful it had been, was no longer sustainable, and to choose the harder, more frightening path of building something new rather than the easier, more familiar path of quietly running out of options in a place that no longer made financial or emotional sense for her. I don't think everyone facing a similar situation should move to the Philippines or to any other country. That's not the lesson I'd want anyone to take from my story. The lesson, I think, is something closer to this. It is never too late to admit that something in your life isn't working, and it is never too late, not at 73, not at any age, to choose to build something different, even if it terrifies you, even if the people around you think you've lost your mind, even if you're not entirely sure yourself whether you're running away from something or finally, after years of quiet suffering, running toward it. I still think about Frank every single day. I still keep his wedding ring in that small wooden box, now sitting on a shelf in my condo overlooking a garden I never imagined I'd call my own. I like to believe he would understand what I did. I like to believe he'd recognize, in this new life I've built so far from everything we shared together, the same stubborn optimism that made him plant a lemon tree the week we moved into a house we weren't entirely sure we could afford. We built that life on faith that things would work out. I'm building this one the same way, trusting that a woman in her 70s can still learn a new language, still make new friends, still find new purpose, still surprise herself with what she's capable of when the life she expected to live is no longer available to her. There are mornings now when I sit on the small balcony of my condo with a cup of coffee, watching the light move across the garden below, and I think about how differently my life has unfolded from anything I ever planned. I think about the young nurse who fell in love with a man fixing a flickering light in an ICU hallway. I think about the years of slow, steady building, the house, the sun, the lemon tree, the life we thought would simply continue indefinitely, because that is what we had always known. I think about the illness that took that life apart, and the years of quiet financial unraveling that followed, and the shame that kept me silent about it for far too long. I think about the sign in the yard, and the empty living room, and the flight across an ocean I never expected to take. And I think, most of all, about how frightened I was, and how that fright turned out not to be the end of my story, but simply the doorway into its next chapter. I have learned, in this strange and unexpected second life, that resilience does not always look like strength in the way we usually imagine it. Sometimes it looks like admitting you cannot keep doing what you have always done. Sometimes it looks like accepting help from a colleague you haven't spoken to in years. Sometimes it looks like crying on a street corner in a country where you don't speak the language, and then getting up anyway and asking a stranger for directions and finding your way home regardless. I have also learned that grief and joy are not opposites the way I once believed them to be. They live together, layered on top of each other, the way Frank's memory lives alongside my grandson's laughter, the way the ache of losing my old life lives alongside the genuine contentment I've found in this new one. I did not stop grieving Frank when I moved here. I simply found a way to carry that grief alongside something else, something lighter, something that lets me keep going. The sold sign stayed in front of my house for less than 48 hours. It took me considerably longer to understand that what I lost that week was never really a house at all. It was simply the life I thought I was supposed to have. What I found instead, on the other side of that loss, was a life I actually get to choose. One mango, one Sunday service, one dinner with new friends, one small clinic, morning at a time. At 73, I thought my story was ending. It turns out it was only just beginning again.